Do you spend more time thinking about your fantasy novel than actually writing it? That creative perfectionism might feel like dedication, but it's actually the first sign that your story is in danger of never seeing the light of day. I've spent over 2 decades writing fantasy and seen my fair share of projects that ended up in an endless cycle of almost done. So in this video, I'm pulling back the curtain on the 6 deadliest traps I've fallen into, the same ones that might be strangling your story right now. And the first of these traps lurks right at the beginning of your novel. Be honest, how many times have you rewritten your first chapter? Once? 5 times? 17 times? The desire to make a strong first impression is natural. After all, this is where readers decide whether to continue with your story. But there is a dark side to this perfectionism that few talk about. I spend a lot of time as a writer stuck in this exact position, polishing and re-polishing those initial pages. So let me share a story that might sound familiar. I had this epic opening scene where my protagonists discovered they could control shadows. I rewrote that scene countless times, trying to capture the perfect balance of mystery and revelation. I changed the weather, the time of day, the character's reaction, everything. I was convinced that if I could just get this one scene perfect, the rest of the novel could flow naturally. The irony is that while I was obsessing over that first chapter, I hadn't even defined my story's emotional core, what I now call the story promise. I see this as an emotional contract between you and your future readers. Without knowing what journey I was taking readers on, how could I possibly know if this opening was setting up the right expectations? Even worse, while I was obsessing over my first chapter, the excitement for the rest of the story began to fade. The more I rewrote, the more pressure I put on every other chapter to live up to this perfect beginning. It was like trying to build a house by continuously repainting the front door. The truth is, a lot of your first chapter will likely need to be rewritten once you finish your story. Why? Because the beginning of your novel needs to set up plot threads, character arcs, and themes that you won't fully understand until you've written the ending. Here's what I do now. I treat my first chapter like a placeholder. I write it well enough to establish the basic elements I need, the main character, the initial conflict, and the hook, but I don't let myself revise it until I've completed the first draft. Think of it like sketching the outline of a painting before filling in the details. And speaking of necessary information, there's another deadly trap that feels productive but actually guarantees you'll never type the end. Did you know that George R. R. Martin once said that he gets letters from his fans correcting him about the smallest details, such as medieval horse armor? But here's what's fascinating, he didn't let that stop him from continuing to write further in the series. Now, research is seductive, I know. It feels like writing, after all you're learning about your craft, right? And fantasy readers are known for their attention to detail. The fear of getting something wrong can be paralyzing, but there's a crucial distinction between research that serves your story and research that serves as procrastination. Let me share a personal example that changed how I approach research forever. I was writing a scene where my character needed to forge a sword. Simple enough, but I wanted it to be authentic. So I started researching medieval blacksmithing. 3 weeks later, I had filled notebooks with information about different types of steel, ancient forging techniques, and the specific temperatures needed for various processes. By now, I've forgotten a lot of these details already, but back then I could probably have written a textbook on blacksmithing. But I still hadn't written the actual scene. What I realized was that my readers didn't need to know the exact temperature at which steel becomes malleable. They needed to feel the heat of the forge, hear the ring of the hammer, and understand what this moment meant for my character's growth. The brutal truth is that research can become a security blanket. It's safer to read about medieval farming practices than to face the blank page. But here's what's changed everything for me. I started using what I call the TBD method. Here's how it works in practice. When I'm writing and come across something I need to verify, I simply write something like, the blacksmith heated the metal until it glowed, TBD research color, then began to shape it with precise strikes. This keeps the momentum going while ensuring I can come back and add accuracy later. Think of it like building a house. You don't need to know exactly what kind of nails you're going to use before you start drawing up the plans. Those details matter. They don't matter right now. I found that this approach has another unexpected benefit. When I finally do my research, I know exactly what information I need. Instead of gathering random facts about blacksmithing, I can focus on specific details that actually serve my story. It's the difference between buying everything in a hardware store and making a focused trip for exactly what you need. But even if you avoided the research rabbit hole, there's an even more insidious trap waiting. one that masquerades as creative freedom, but actually imprisons your story before it even begins. Many fantasy writers often believe that more detail equals better world building. It's why we're drawn to authors like Tolkien, who created entire languages and mythologies. But there is something crucial about Tolkien that often gets overlooked, something that explains why he actually finished his novels while so many world builders never do. I learned this lesson the hard way. I spent almost an entire year developing a fantasy world before I wrote a single scene. I created detailed maps, designed intricate political systems, and developed complex religious hierarchies. I even thought about the recipes for traditional dishes from different regions. It did feel amazing, like I was creating something real and tangible. But when I finally sat down to write the story, I froze. The world had become so complex, so detailed, that I was paralyzed by the fear of contradicting my own lore. Every sentence felt like walking through a minefield of potential inconsistencies. The secret is this: Tolkien didn't start with the Silmarillion. He started with a simple story about a hobbit finding a ring. The vast majority of his world building came after he'd already written his core narratives. Here's what I do now. I focus only on the elements of the world that directly impact my protagonist's journey in the first few chapters. Everything else gets added on a need-to-know basis. Think about it like this. If your character is a village healer, you don't need to know the political structure of every kingdom on your map. You need to know about local herbs, village politics, and perhaps the basics of how magic works in your world. The rest can grow organically as your story demands it. But even with a perfectly balanced world, there is another trap that's especially dangerous because it feels so right. In fact, the next habit is probably something you might be doing right now. Have you ever met someone who's been planning the novel for years? They can tell you every plot twist, every character arc, every significant moment, but they've never written page 1. There's a fascinating psychological reason for this. Planning feels productive. It gives you the emotional satisfaction of creating without the messy reality of actually writing. And in the fantasy genre, where complex plots and character relationships are common, it seems especially important to have everything mapped out, right? I used to be that person. I had notebooks filled with detailed outlines. I could tell you exactly what would happen in chapter 27, down to the specific conversations between characters. I spent hours creating beautiful mind maps showing how every plot thread connected. It felt like I was doing important work. After all, doesn't every writing guide tell you to plan your novel? The truth is, excessive planning can kill your novel before you start. When you plan everything in microscopic detail, you're essentially telling yourself the story. This satisfies the creative urge without producing actual pages. Here's what changed everything for me personally. I started using the scene map approach, focusing only on those crucial emotional waypoints that transform my character. For each major waypoint, I would map out 3 scenes, one that builds toward it, one where it happens, and one that shows its consequences. Everything else develops as I write. Sometimes my characters surprise me by making unexpected choices. Sometimes new plot threads emerge that I could never have planned for. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. Moving on, there's another trap that for some writers is more dangerous than all the others so far combined. It's so subtle that they don't even realize it's destroying their chances of success. Imagine if J.R.R. Tolkien had given up because he thought he couldn't write as well as William Shakespeare. Sounds ridiculous, right? But you might be doing something equally self-defeating without even realizing it. Every fantasy writer has those moments, reading Brandon Sanderson's magic systems, or getting lost in Patrick Rothfuss's prose. The gap between what we can create and what we admire seems impossibly wide. This feeling of dread and despair is incredibly powerful, and understanding it was a game changer for my own writing. Let me share something embarrassing. I once spent 3 hours trying to rewrite a single paragraph because it wasn't as good as Rothfuss. I kept thinking about how he would describe the scene, how he would choose the perfect metaphor. Every sentence I wrote felt clumsy and amateur in comparison. And it might have been, but I also nearly gave up writing that day. But here's the reality. You're comparing your first draft to published books that have gone through years of revision, professional editing, and polishing. Even worse, you're probably comparing your beginning to multiple different authors' strongest elements, like Sanderson's magic, Rothfuss's prose, or George R. R. Martin's political intrigue. This is why I prefer to start with what I call emotional drafts. Focus on capturing the heart of your scenes first. Don't worry if your prose isn't as lyrical as Rothfuss or your magic system isn't as detailed as Sanderson's. Those elements can be refined during revision. Here's what I do now when I catch myself falling into the comparison trap. I remind myself that I'm seeing published books, not first drafts. I focus on what I can learn from these authors rather than trying to match them. I celebrate my own voice and style instead of trying to imitate others. And I keep a folder of my old writing to track my progress. This approach has been liberating. Instead of trying to write like other authors, I'm working on writing the best version of my own story in my own voice. And you know what? That's exactly what those authors did too. Remember, your first novel doesn't need to be a masterpiece. It needs to be finished. But even if you overcome your comparison anxiety, there's one final trap so alluring that it can derail even the most dedicated writer. What if I told you that having too many amazing story ideas could be worse than having none at all? Every writer knows that rush of excitement when a new story idea appears. The characters feel alive, the plot seems perfect, and the world practically builds itself. It's intoxicating. And for fantasy writers who often have especially vivid imaginations, these moments of inspiration can come frequently. I know that from experience. I'd be working on my current novel, struggling with a difficult scene or trying to fix a plot hole, when suddenly, bam, a new idea would hit me. Maybe I'd seen a stranger on the street with an interesting scar, and suddenly my mind would be racing with possibilities. Who were they? How did they get that scar? Before I knew it, I'd have an entire new story forming in my mind, complete with a magic system based on ancient scars and a complex society of marked warriors. The worst part? These new ideas always seemed more exciting than my current project because they hadn't faced the reality of actually writing yet. They hadn't needed a story promise, a scene map, or any of the hard work that comes with turning an idea into a finished novel. I used to jump from project to project, convinced that each new idea was better than the last. My computer became a graveyard of chapter 1s and detailed outlines. It took me years to recognize the hidden cost of this pattern, and the surprising psychology behind why new ideas seem so much more appealing than our current project. Think about relationships for a moment. You know how some people always think the grass is greener with someone new? They jump from relationship to relationship, never staying long enough to build something deep and meaningful. That's exactly what we do with our story ideas in this case. New ideas are seductive because they are perfect in our mind. They haven't faced the challenges of actual writing, the plot holes, the character inconsistencies, the awkward dialogue. When you're struggling with your current project, that shiny new idea promises an escape from all these difficulties. But here's what I learned. The only way to become a better writer and to actually finish something is to push through these challenges. Each new idea carries the same hidden problems. You just can't see them until you start writing. So what changed everything for me was starting an ideas journal. Instead of abandoning my current project every time inspiration struck, I began recording new ideas in detail. I would write down the basic premise, any cool scenes I imagined, and potential plot points. Then, and this is crucial, I would close the journal and return to my work in progress. This practice taught me something fascinating. Many of those perfect new ideas lost their shine after a few days. The ones that kept nagging at me, that grew stronger over time, those went into a special section of my journal for future projects. But I made a rule that I couldn't start any of them until I finished my current draft. Think of it like planting a garden. You can't grow a healthy plant if you keep digging it up to plant something new. Sometimes you have to trust the process, even when the soil looks empty and you can't see any growth happening beneath the surface. Now that you understand these 6 deadly traps, you might be wondering what actually works then. And for that, watch this video here next, where I share more about story promise, scene maps, and how I would approach a new fantasy novel in 2025.